You are listening to Enthusiasts, a show about the most passionate of passionate people, both specific fandoms and fandom culture, internet culture, enthusiast culture, period. I will link to a directory, including descriptions and streaming links to every past episode in the episode description here. But if for some reason this link does not work for you, you can also check out back episodes at the guide on the site of my other podcast, 17caratkpop.weebly.com, if you click on the Enthusiast tab. Enjoy the show! If you're like me and are kind of fascinated with the world of right-wing media and conspiracy theory figures and where they converge, where their audiences overlap, this conversation is for you, talking about Alex Jones and his show InfoWars. And breaking it down are the experts of InfoWars, Dan and Jordan, on their podcast, Knowledge Fight, where they provide a lot of interesting context, fact checks, and just live reactions to a bunch of stuff that happens on the show. So you'll learn a lot of interesting facts about the truth that is being distorted behind these rumors that he spreads. It's a very interesting take on everything that show does and says, and an interesting window into the psyche of this kind of person. But there is no one quite like him, which you will soon find out. Here is my conversation with Dan, one of the Knowledge Fight co-hosts, about Knowledge Fight and InfoWars. First things first, would you mind just kind of sharing with my listeners kind of the backstory of what Knowledge Fight's all about and like how you even got started and what made you think this is the good idea for the show? I have so many questions about how this got started.
Well, I guess I would start by saying that I don't think that when we started, it was thought of by us as a good idea for a show. Jordan and I were both stand-ups. When we started the show, he was still pretty active in doing stand-up, but I had already given up and quit on it. It wasn't something I was interested in pursuing. But we were used to failure, and we were used to projects that we would do lasting like 6 months, 9 months or something, and then reaching its natural conclusion. And so when we started, we kind of thought that was what we were getting into. We thought like, we'll do this for a little bit. And we didn't realize until a bit in that like, there's something here. And then people were really responding to it well after a while. And I think that kind of gave us the motivation to keep going. In terms of what it is, it's a show about Alex Jones, but it's also about broader right-wing narratives and the sort of historical lineage of mostly anti-communism derived propaganda and conspiracy theory over time. So I guess if you had any more specific questions, I may have lost track of what you were asking.
No, it's okay. I was just kind of wondering, I guess, one other component of it I'm curious about though is like, when do you even remember when you first heard of Alex Jones and decided to even do a one-time podcast talking about him?
I can't really think of when I first heard of him because in my years after college, I was aimless and you'd watch things online and I was aware of Alex Jones from I guess I wouldn't have been able to name his movies or anything, but I knew of him as the 9/11 guy and I knew he was a conspiracy theorist and I had this sort of picture of him as a renegade kind of guy and what have you. And then into 2015-ish, that area of time, 2015 into 2016, I started to recognize some weirdness. When Trump started running, everything felt weird. And I started to see a few clips here and there of Alex Jones, and he was screaming about loving Trump, and it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like what my mental conception of what he was. It didn't match. And so I decided just out of boredom, and like I said, I'd quit doing stand-up and I was working a 9-to-5 job, and I was like, I want to see what this is about. This is confusing. And so I started watching his shows, and I was like, I thought wow, this is not like anything I expected it to be. He's praying on air. It was just such a different thing than what the image of it looked like to me. And that's really that's what motivated me into thinking I gotta tell people about this because no one was talking about what his show actually was. And at the time, me and Jordan would go out to bars pretty regularly and have some drinks and scream at each other about various things. And so one day I was just I'm thinking about doing a show about Alex Jones, and ever the incredibly supportive friend he is, he's like, all right, let's do it. And so we just did one, and then I think it was the next day I was like, Jordan, we got to do another episode. There was just
Yeah.
an immediate, like, I got to talk more about this. You're not going to believe what he said on this other show. The ball ran really fast from there.
It's interesting because the more I was getting familiar with InfoWars through Knowledge Fight, the more I realized there actually is a lot to it. You make a lot of like context out of the nonsense. Part of the reason I like Knowledge Fight is like I never really know what I'm going to find out he talked about. As much as Alex Jones seems very formulaic, he's also like the sheer amount of things he's saying.
Yeah.
There's so many directions you could take it. So some days the context you add is like scientific research. Some days the context is historical, or suddenly like I don't know what topic I'm going to learn about, but I'm going to learn a lot from a lot of nothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And the other thing that adds into that is that Alex is weird. He doesn't have a boss. He's super rich, and he has an audience that allows him to lash out on air. And so, like, in terms of that, you never know what you're going to get. It often does feel that way when you listen to the show, too. Like, sometimes, like, oh, he's in a bad mood. This is going to really, he's going to start talking about how we're all deserve to die or something. And that does help keep some sanity while going through it.
For sure. Actually, it's kind of an odd starting point for me, but when I first really got into Knowledge Fight was when you were doing the whole like dissection of the talk with Kanye and with Tim Pool, I believe, and one other guy. That whole weird conversation, like there's no other word for it.
It was a bad couple days.
Yeah, for sure. But what interested me about that was the angle you took about pointing out what he's doing, because there are some interesting, and not just him, but Tim Pool and the others too, like the persuasion tactics they're using, or the ways they're trying to kind of frame things or change the framing of things. Like there's a lot to read into in like their message. So I guess my question is, do you think people are often getting the wrong caricature of who Alex is? He's actually worth taking more seriously, because if you read into what him and his guests that he platforms are saying, there actually is more substance than they think it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a danger on the other side of that too, which is taking him too seriously, which I think some people fall into and turn him into like he's a, mastermind behind the scenes and, all this stuff, which, you don't want to err on that side, but yeah, I do think a lot of people have the wrong caricature of him. And some of that is just, I think by virtue of social media and the way you can post a funny clip of him or something, and there's no context to it. People, the gay frogs clip, certainly people pass that around and they're entertained by it, or there's that. I think one of the things that people should be aware of if they're covering him or people like him is there was something that I remember hearing about pickup artists. They were a big thing back when I was a little more active in going to like house parties and bars and stuff. And I remember it being pretty clear to me that if you point out what they're doing, their game doesn't work anymore. If you are like, oh, I see what you're doing. You're trying to nag this girl so she feels insecure so you can pick up on her or something like that. It just falls apart. And the person doesn't really, it's laid bare in front of people's eyes, and the trick doesn't work. And I think with Alex, it's kind of the same thing. When discussing the things that he's doing, it's important to understand or give voice to the game that he's playing, because calling it out makes it far less powerful as that like persuasive technique. And so it's something that I try to keep in mind. Sometimes stuff he does is just funny and stupid. Mm-hmm. So there's not really much like one Christmas Eve, he was drunk throwing hatchets in his studio, and like, not much to say about this in terms of manipulation. He's just drunk.
It's interesting the way you put that, because I was talking on a past episode with Kelly Weil. She wrote this book about flat earth believers and stuff. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about the people who argue, don't give a platform to these kind of views and stuff, even if you're debunking. And she just had a really interesting counter argument about like, well, they actually really don't want you to talk about them. Like, mm-hmm. They don't want you to point out, look at this paper-thin defense of whatever. Like, giving it kind of like sunlight as a disinfectant kind of a thing. Do you kind of see your show as kind of, that would be your argument too, if people say, don't even listen to Alex Jones?
Well, I would say people shouldn't listen to Alex Jones because it's really long and his shows are super repetitive. And, in order to get the, like, content that we have for our shows, I have to listen to, like, mountains of this nonsense. as much as there is to talk about on our show that's interesting, the experience, if you wanted to have it, of listening to his show would be very different and awful. If you're curious, go ahead and listen to it, but it's not good. I think that sunlight is a disinfectant, but not on its own. I think that ignoring people like Alex and his ilk, that's definitely not work. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked. And we see the results of that. But at the same time, sort of random, undisciplined sunshine can tend to play into people's games, per se. There are people like Tim Pools of the world and folks like that who, a lot of times they say sensational things in order to get people to tweet about them or, get outraged about it. It's outrage bait. And then that works towards spreading their message further. So paying attention to things like that, I think, is maybe not worthwhile. But focused analysis of these things, and like you said, like pointing out the paper-thin defense of a lot of their main points, that I think is absolutely the best disinfectant that I've found.
With your process of actually like picking what clips to take and use on Knowledge Fight, has that kind of changed? Like, have you kind of learned, oh, this is kind of a telltale sign he's about to go on a pointless rant, or, oh, I know he's about to say something that I actually should flag? Have you felt like you kind of improved at picking up on what is worth covering?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the one of the challenges I think is that, like, at the beginning when we started the show, it was not what it is now. We were drinking wine, and our view of it was we're going to make fun of an idiot. And that was kind of what it was for, maybe 20-something episodes. I mean, we still drank wine quite a bit after that. But it was kind of like we don't know what we're doing. We're trying to gain some context. And I was pulling clips that I felt were interesting or funny. But over time, I started to notice things and trends, topics that he covered more regularly and things that seemed more interesting. And so I erred towards those and left some of the trivialities aside. And then because we've done so many episodes, it now has become a thing where, he talks about X, Y, or Z thing, and we do a conversation about behind this, give context for it. And then it feels like, well, he's going to bring this up again. So the next time he brings it up, I can't do the quote unquote debunking of this again. It narrows down the he's talking about Building 7 again. Okay, well, I guess I'll wait till he gets to some other topic. So it's something that I would have thought would be crippling to our podcast because I don't want to be repetitive. I don't want to cover the same thing over and over again. And we're 800 or so episodes, or almost 800 episodes in, and I really don't think that we've covered stuff repeatedly that much. He's just that weird and says that much dumb stuff. He's a fountain of idiocy. But yeah, your question actually made me think of something interesting, and that is that, like, over time, I have been able to get a sense of when it's like, all right, he is gearing up to something. Or I can tell when he's prepared or thought in advance about something. And that doesn't always end up being something meaningful. But I can get a sense of like, aha, this isn't just rambling off the top of his head. I feel like that is a really bad sign of some sort of a parasocial connection that I have with him.
Do you have any like palate cleanser media? Like after you have to watch an episode of his show, like it's got to feel like you're losing brain cells as you listen to it.
Yeah. Oh, one thing I do is sometimes I'll play like a video game while I'm listening to the episodes, because there are long stretches of stuff where it's like, well, I'm listening to this, but it's not anything all that interesting. Like I said, he talks forever, often about nothing. That kind of helps. Not like take my attention off things, but have something else that exists. I'm not just staring at my computer listening to him talk. Other than that, yeah, I mean, I like, it's hard because I listen to so much media to listen to other podcasts because I spend so much of my time with the headphones on and what have you. But, things like the Doughboys, I love listening to those guys argue about food. So that's sort of a palate cleanser. And Survivor. I've watched all 43 seasons of Survivor. So
really?
That's something.
Yeah, for sure. Switching gears here, I'm curious what you think about how much. I know Alex Jones is not a big fan of actually like planning and preparing for episodes, but I mean, there are a lot of people in his kind of lane with like conspiracy theories, right-wing media, like that whole information ecosystem, who clearly know they're lying and they're grifting, they're trying to get money from their supporters, or they're just exploiting the fears of their base. And then there are others like the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world who I think, no, they 100% believe all the theories they're spouting. And like, do you see Alex Jones as like one of those people, or one of those he really firmly believes a lot of these conspiracies, or he's just kind of getting the clout, or is it a mix?
It's interesting because I wouldn't have put Marjorie Taylor Greene in that category, but
Oh, really?
I haven't paid as much attention to, but she's disowned a lot of like the Q stuff that she was into in the past, right? I mean, like, she was a true believer. She might be holding on to more of that, but I don't know. She is not someone who I've spent a lot of time on. With Alex, it's interesting because I think it is a mix. In terms of his backstory and history, his dad was a big member of the John Birch Society when he was younger. And so there was a lot of John Birch Society literature around the house. And, a lot of the people who were his dad's associates were weirdo, right-wing extremists, basically. And so he was marinated in that from an early age. And he read these things. And according to him, when he was 12, I believe, he read None Dare Call It Conspiracy by Gary Allen. And that woke him up and blew his mind. And from a young age, he has this basis in these historical anti-communist hardliners from, around the Cold War and after the Cold War. These people who were aggressively opposed the Civil Rights Act and the rightest of the right wing, to the point where, like, the Republican Party disowned a lot of it for many years, and now we're getting back to it. But he had that, so he knows his stuff, and a lot of stuff is based on that. And so there is that bedrock of stuff that I think that he would be able, you could categorize him as a true believer in a lot of that. Then there's a lot of other stuff that I don't think he actually believes in. Like, I don't believe that he thinks that everything's a false flag. I don't believe that he thinks every election is stolen or whatever, like some of these more modern examples. And I think that he does a lot of that because he has seen historically the ways that those kinds of narratives boost traffic, they boost sales on his site. And so there is a grifty aspect to that kind of stuff that he does. But at his core, I think, there is that anti-communist tradition through the John Birch Society and offshoots of that. And then also a Christian identity kind of leaning in this very, very severe, I'm reluctant to call it fundamentalist because I don't think it's exactly that, but he has a very strange, extreme right-wing version of Christianity that I do believe is fairly sincere on his part. So it's a weird mix. It's tough to say one way or the other.
Well, especially with apocalyptic type end of the world theories, because a lot of end of the world prophesizing it has roots in certain parts of Christianity. It also has roots in it also is intrinsically related to his business because he sells all that end of the world merch and stuff.
Sure. It's hard to tell, what's the hand and what's the glove. And then, in terms of his, Christianity, it's so weird. He hates most Christians. And the only church or pastor that I've ever really heard him say that he's been to or he supports is this guy Tex Mars, who is a lunatic anti-Semite conspiracy theorist, who also runs a church. And if that's the Christianity that he subscribes to, I don't want to call it fundamentalist, but it's messed up.
Do you think learning kind of about what kind of views formed Alex's current worldview, learning more about his backstory, has that kind of helped you, because there's certain episodes, I don't know how to put this. I mean, I wouldn't say it's you're making sure not to dehumanize him, but for example, there were the public texts that came out from him and his wife and he was trying to text his dad. His dad, to my knowledge, never texted back. All these public messages, you covered them interestingly on Knowledge Fight and intentionally didn't cover all of them, the more salacious ones or the more personal ones. Sometimes I just wonder how you resist the urge, I guess, to be mean, because we're talking about such a hateful person, but you still kind of talk about him in a way that it's not dehumanizing. I'm just curious how you think about how you talk about someone who is so awful in a way that's still very... caring's not the right word, but you know what I'm trying to say?
Dear God. I try to approach him with that kind of mindset. One of the reasons is because I don't think you need to be dirty or hateful towards him. I think what he does and his career is bad enough. and approached in the proper context and through that lens, I think that he looks even worse than if I were just to be like, look at this idiot, look at him, look at his personal life. And I don't think that there's much to be gained from that. Sometimes a little bit of that can come out in Jordan's responses to things, and that makes more sense. He's a little bit more of the reaction, kind of immediate, like visceral response, and it's kind of my duty to have more of a grounded perspective on things. In the specific case of the texts, we'll cover those more in the future. We just need some distance from it because I was technically involved with the SPLC project on it before I left it. So I didn't want to get in the mix and cover things that I didn't know if they were going to cover in the future. And I just wanted to avoid any possible uncomfortable situation there. The thing with Alex's personal life is it's obviously a mess, and that's all good and well. But I've seen the messages and stuff, and I was involved with the Texas attorneys in his case with Mark Bankston and Bill Ogden. So I have a glimpse into this stuff, but even so, I don't think I understand what's going on. I don't think that seeing messages for instance, what you brought up with Alex texts his dad and then his dad doesn't text him back. We don't know if his dad called him back. There isn't any indications of calls that were made. His dad might have called him back. Or there are very strong indications in the text that some had been deleted. And there's a chance that his dad responded and then they deleted the text. There's really no way to tell. And it's kind of the same thing with a lot of his interpersonal relationships. And I feel like getting too invested in having thoughts or positions about it can only really work against my larger goal of understanding Alex in his career. I don't really care about him as a person, except for as a figure and what he does and the influence that he has on the world. Now, granted, just to be clear, there have been indications from, say, his ex-wife that he's an abusive person, and I am not unempathetic to that. I do care about those kinds of things. I just don't know what I can do in terms of them. I don't know what I could help bring to that.
You're focusing, on what you think you have the knowledge to provide context for.
Yeah. And I think it doesn't do us any good to get too mixed up in a lot of the other stuff. Even on the side of that, I think that, I don't want this to sound vindictive or mean, but I think keeping in mind his humanity and that he is a person makes what he does worse. I think that treating him decently and not getting sensational and salacious with what we do, it puts in very clear picture what he does, what he says, how he operates. And I think he looks like more of a monster for it because, the monster is always human and he's making choices.
He's not like a 2D character.
Yeah. And also I think that there's there's an ugly reality TV-ishness to a lot of people's preoccupations with personal lives of public figures. And I don't know, it makes me uncomfortable.
One thing that I find very interesting that you provide, sometimes you view his show through the lens of and talk about on Knowledge Fight, is comparing it to your past with comedy. You'll say, here's the bit where you do this, or even just kind of jokingly, oh, that's the point in the comedy act where you're supposed to, move on to the next joke or whatever. I'm just curious how you kind of process what Alex is doing kind of like that, like he's doing a bit. The way he puts on his show, do you think your past as a comedian is kind of giving you an interesting perspective on hearing what he has to say through that lens?
I think a little, maybe not as much as we think at times, possibly. But when he's doing something that's on a stage, giving speeches, definitely. Because then it's just sort of he's on stage performing and we can kind of talk about stagecraft and stuff like that. But I think a lot of stand-up comes down to storytelling, or at least the way that maybe I or Jordan approached it. And so there is a need to know how to get to the important points and move things along in a way that's digestible. And there are a lot of points where Alex could tighten his stuff up. There's a lot of points where that training of knowing okay, I'm going to annoy people if I don't get to the point. Maybe it's not that useful. I'm not sure. I think my ideas about pro wrestling are maybe more important to comparing to what Alex does, because there is an element of that kayfabe that wrestling has in what he does. There's an understanding that the audience must have that all of the things that Alex has said is going to happen have not happened, but no one brings it up. Because if you bring it up, it pierces the illusion that this time Alex is right about what's going to happen. That is very sort of reminiscent of the way wrestling works with, the audience mostly knows that what's going on isn't real and the stories are contrived, but it takes you out of it and it's not fun if you think about it that way. You get lost in it. And I think InfoWars is a lot of the same. Like, I think a lot of the people, consciously or not, are buying into the kayfabe of it.
Are there any certain recurring characters on Alex's show that you find especially interesting to kind of see their persuasive tactics or just kind of analyze or provide context for what they say? Or just anyone, I guess, who's an outlandish, typical guest? Is there anyone who, when you know they're on an episode, you're like, okay, this is going to be a good one?
Yeah, there's a few, actually. I mean, the king of that is Steve Pachenik. He's a guy who worked in the State Department for a little while back in the 70s. And actually, he was involved with some negotiations when was it the Prime Minister of Italy, Aldo Moro, got kidnapped. He ended up getting Aldo Moro killed. Then he was not in charge of hostage negotiation stuff in the future. But he has been a guest on Alex's show since 2002. That was his first appearance. And he is somebody who has, walked Alex down the paths of things like Sandy Hook it didn't happen. The Las Vegas shooting was fake. These things that are like really bad things that Alex has done in his career, Steve has been a part of. And he's just so awesome because he lies to Alex with reckless abandon. He tells him that he was instrumental in single-handedly overthrowing the Soviet Union and he killed Itzhak Rabin, I believe he said. These are just outlandish lies that he tells Alex, and Alex just has to go along with it. And then one time, not too long ago, I think it was a little bit after the 2020 election, Steve just straight up told Alex that he's been using him the whole time on air. It was very bizarre. But Steve is great. Whenever he's around, something's going to happen. There was one time that Steve lives in Florida and there was a hurricane and Alex needed to call Steve to get a talking point basically about a rift between Trump and I think H.R. McMaster, General McMaster. And so he called Steve and on air, they're having this conversation and Alex is like, all right, we need to talk about Trump. And Steve's like, you're going to call me in a hurricane and not ask me how I am? He's just giving him he's scolding him about manners. It's awesome. Mm-hmm. So he's great. Yeah. But then I think my favorite of his weirdos is a guy named Leo Zagami. He claims to be a Vatican insider and he knows the secrets of the Illuminati. And one episode, I can't remember what number it was, but it was a while back. I looked into his past and he in the 80s was a really important house DJ in the burgeoning Rome techno scene, like the club scene.
That's not what I thought you would say.
Yeah, he was a DJ named Leo Young and he was really influential and he had a reputation for being really crazy and flamboyant with his moves and stuff. And then a little bit later, I think he went a little bit crazy because there was a video of him. He got arrested and he was ranting about how he did 9/11 and how he was the Messiah and he had created a new religion based on the movie The Matrix. So he's great. None of this stuff from his actual past is ever talked about on InfoWars. But if there's anybody from InfoWars that I'd like to talk to, it would be him. Just because of that, what was it like in the 80s? And he was huge at the time. He's weird.
Yeah, that's very weird. Are there any certain topics that have been covered on InfoWars that were extra interesting, even just for you to research and look more into, or I don't know, any certain episode theme or what stands out to you? I mean, I guess you could call it a favorite episode, but I'll save it. Well, maybe I'll see what yours is first.
Well, I'm not sure if it's a favorite episode, but I like when things come back. I like when things are sort of Jordan has a expression that he uses a lot that's there's not enough people. It's just when these people keep reoccurring in various places. And so lately, because we are talking a lot about 2004, 2003, 2004 period at the moment. And so this guy, Ted Gunderson, who was an FBI agent who then ended up being really involved in the Satanic Panic, he keeps popping up all over the place because he's involved in all of these weird satanic ritual cult sacrifice of children type narratives from back then. So he shows up a lot. And then in the more present day, there's this guy named Dennis Montgomery, who I discovered on, I think, episode like 25, like way back. And he was a guy who defrauded Joe Arpaio, the sheriff, with this fake information about, it's a load of nonsense. But anyway, he has been constantly at the center of weird high profile frauds. Like most recently, he was the source of the information that Mike Lindell was using to prove that the 2020 election was fake. Or was stolen. And it's just, this guy has been a con man going back 10 years at least, probably more. Well, definitely more than that. Like, cause he defrauded the US government prior to all this. He told the US government that he had this software that could analyze things that were on Al Jazeera and they could use that to predict terrorist attacks, but it was entirely fake. And so he went from that to bouncing around to defrauding all of these right-wing people. And he just keeps coming back. So whenever he comes up, I get really excited. Figures are just, no one knows their names and they're so important.
Yeah, it feels like there could be a podcast about each of them. Like there's a lot there.
There could be a mini-series on Serial or NPR somewhere about Dennis Montgomery for sure. That guy he just won't go away.
Yeah. Well, my, I guess you could call it favorite, or just one of the moments that I keep thinking about, because the first time I heard it, I just stopped in my tracks, is when Alex for the first time was talking about how much he thinks he may have to eat his neighbors at the end of the world. That just left me speechless because it went on for like 10 minutes.
It did. And he did it twice, I think.
Yeah, he did.
That's what I'm talking about when I say he's weird. No one else would do that.
Yeah, it's just, there's so many moments where it's hard to explain, but it's still interesting.
Something like that I guess sticks out as like a real favorite is there was an episode where Alex decided that he was going to announce who the most important man in the world was.
Oh, yeah, I know this, yeah.
And he takes forever to get to it. And he keeps hyping it. And while I was listening to the episode, I was just thinking like, Jordan is going to lose his mind. This is going to be so great. He's going to be furious. And paid off. It all worked out exactly how I thought it would. And spoiler alert, Tucker Carlson is the most important person in the world.
Who he said earlier in the episode was not it, or implied it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, he needed to keep the suspense alive. And boy, did he.
Yeah. Yeah, he seems to have a habit of kind of teasing things that don't pan out. I'm pretty sure that he never, and maybe it just wasn't on your show, but pretty sure he never actually revealed his predictions for 2023.
Nope, I never heard him. And then there's another one that we're still waiting for, which was that he said that he was going to remove a chip out of a homeless person on air because he had learned that Austin was putting chips in all the unhoused population. I think it had something to do with like a larger brain control narrative. But that never happened. I was pretty disappointed. I thought that would be fun.
Yeah, wow, there's a lot of empty promises with this show.
Yeah, you kind of have to just get used to that.
Yeah. Thinking about like the episodes from like back in the early 2000s to now, what do you think are the biggest changes in Alex or in the show itself? The things that really are like, this is not the show it used to be.
Well, I think Alex had some sense of self-respect in the past. Not a ton. Like he didn't, at least as a professional figure, didn't take himself like hyper seriously in the sense that he would go and like bullhorn people and do public spectacle kind of stuff. He would do that even early in his career, but like the way he acts now is so ridiculous and it's very difficult to take seriously. And I think even his past self would look at what he's doing now and be like, this is a disgrace. And so I think there was a little bit of some kind of dignity that he had in the past. I think in the past he probably wouldn't have gotten sucked down so many like 4chan type based conspiracies. I think he might have had a little more self-control about some of that stuff. I don't know if we'd ever be able to prove it, but...
Do you think his audience has kind of changed too? Because like with social media and 4chan and stuff, the people listening to Alex Jones type shows are different.
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of competition that he didn't have before. Like the ease of access to, back when he started, he had to be on public access and then someone had to give him a job on a radio station. Like it wasn't free to play, basically. Now, if you have a microphone, or even if you don't, you can make a YouTube video on your phone or TikToks, and people can gather a following that way. And so I think he has a little bit like where he used to be the king of the roost and like basically was the guy of conspiracy stuff. Now it's not so much. He has other people to contend with. And I think that is the dynamic of the audience. So I think he has like a little bit of a solid audience that isn't going away and has been around forever. And then there's just a rotating door of people who get interested in what he does and then either realize it's nonsense and go away, or they get red pilled, but they think that Alex is kind of like, oh, he's not telling me the whole story. And so they go to something a little bit more extreme to get their kicks. And so I think that wasn't the case earlier in his career. Like, I don't think that he had to contend with that dynamic. And I think that made him a little bit more secure in his place. And maybe that contributed to that, like, at least appearance of dignity.
Yeah, now he's a bit more desperate, I think.
Yeah.
Do you think it's ever possible that he could be, like, back on top the way he once was, or is the peak of his fame definitely over?
Oh, that's interesting. Nah, I think he's out, like in terms of it ever going back to that dynamic that he once had. But I never would have thought that Trump would have won necessarily. I mean, I thought it was a possibility, but I was still surprised. I never would have thought that the conspiracies about the 2020 election would have gotten to the point where people stormed the Capitol. A lot of this stuff seemed like possibilities, but it didn't seem inevitable. I think that there's some stuff that Alex could do. Like, I think if he gets arrested and it turns into a political prisoner thing, maybe he's able to broadcast from behind bars or something. There's a couple more, like, chapters in his career that are possible. But in terms of, like, him being the conspiracy guy, I think that QAnon has screwed that up. It's become so diffuse that now there is no need for the figurehead, the gatekeeper type figure.
It seems like with social media and stuff, all of these different kind of conspiratorial groups, now they're all just this giant, the Venn diagram is now a circle when it wasn't before, the doomsday prepper types, and then you have like anti-vaxxers, and then you have just right-wing people, and now they're all the same people, and so now they're kind of getting their kicks from someone who's not Alex, is just how I see it, I think. It's kind of fascinating how he still has an audience all these years later and seemingly still will. But I'm curious, do you kind of have any, not predictions maybe, but just thoughts about where the future of InfoWars is going, especially with the wake of him not doing as well financially as he once did?
Yeah, I think it's a slow bleed now, basically. He is doing this bankruptcy thing that is probably going to get him in more trouble than it will help him avoid trouble. I have some strong feelings based on the things that I've seen from these court appearances he's made. Maybe there's not a full disclosure being made by him and his side. So I think that there are some liabilities that he has from that, but even if not, he could appeal the damages that have been awarded to the Sandy Hook families, but it's not going to go differently the next time around. And even if he does appeal, it's going to be a super expensive process for him. It's going to bog him down even more. He's already tried to get the attention that he can get from the cases. And now if he appeals, he's just going to be doing the same thing over again. I think that'll bore his audience a bit. I don't know. I think it's based on like watching his show. I do think that it's stale in a way that it has to be because he has so much other worry in his life and all this other stuff that's going on. So he doesn't feel like his heart is in it. If I had an ideal future for him, it would be that he gets back to his roots and does something really weird. The like broadcasting from prison. That would be awesome. I would love that. I would be very interested to see what he did. He recently tried to launch his own AlexJones.live. That was supposed to be this totally different company. I think he was trying to hide money in a fake other company, but he had this plan where he was going to do shows where he would take callers while he paints. And he was going to do like Bob Ross type thing. I was like, please do this, please. I want this so bad. I would love that. If that was the future of him, it would make my job more interesting because at this point, he's just feels like he's circling a drain.
Maybe, yeah, he should just do like a total show revamp and every episode he does something he promised us he would do and never did.
Oh, yeah, like tying up knots or, like putting a bow on his career. Just, that would be
Yes.
awesome.
So many unanswered questions, so many predictions he never committed to.
I think we probably have a list somewhere for him.
Mm-hmm.
So if he needs ideas, I got
Yeah.
him.
Have you thought about, because it's sometimes, like you said, he's getting kind of stale, or just he doesn't have the level of emotion and exciting things to read into or react to that he once did. Have you considered like maybe more future Knowledge Fight episodes might focus on other characters in his orbit or other subjects?
Yeah, maybe. I always try and keep an eye out for folks that could be interesting to cover, but like no one is like him. No one is as crazy as him, to put it in some way. Like I said, he doesn't have a boss. His brain is weird. The way he thinks is fascinating, and he has a rooted tradition. Like a lot of these newer people, folks even like Tim Pool, like you brought up, they're essentially trolls. I'm not really interested in somebody who doesn't really have a backing in something grounded, who's just sort of messing around and trying to rile people up for, social media traction and, things to boost their numbers. Alex is rooted in this anti-communism. He is rooted in this John Birch Society stuff. There is an intellectual tradition to him, and it's also in addition to him not having a boss and being a lunatic. It's a mix that I can't find in anybody else.
He also kind of gives you his spur of the moment thoughts. His studio's right there. Like he just can run into the studio and say, emergency podcast.
I think that his studio is actually fairly far from his house, but he can I think he has a mini studio in his house. But yeah, or he can just turn on his phone and record something. He's a little lazy sometimes. But yeah, and sometimes he does stuff that's petty. Like he'll complain about movies and stuff, and that's a nice break.
Yeah.
I recently tried to, because of all the transphobia that's going on and how that's definitely a problem that attention should be put on, I was trying to look at like Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh, and their shows are just dead zones. There's just nothing going on. They're horrible as broadcasters. They're uninteresting. And essentially their shows, I think, are geared around kind of a boring show and then having at least one or two points that are geared to anger people enough that they'll go viral. That model to me just is not interesting.
Yeah, it's like there are a lot of figures that are like contrarian for the sake of being contrarian.
Mm-hmm.
Alex is more like contrarian mixed with telling you that he's contrarian in the weirdest way.
Mm-hmm. And then sometimes having to be contrarian against his own position just because he's that defiant.
Contrarian, if that even exists.
Yeah, he's just unlike anyone else. And that's unfortunate for him too, because the rest of the people who work at InfoWars are zeros.
What I found one of the more interesting episodes of Knowledge Fight was, it was quite a while ago. I listened to it way after it came out. He did a Q&A with Glenn Greenwald.
Yeah, about his that documentary.
Yeah, and he was talking about his documentary and stuff, and the episode was kind of focused on kind of pointing out like what they're both trying to do. There was a lot of unspoken things left unsaid, messages they were sending without, not the literal message, but just in terms of rhetoric and how they wanted to frame Alex Jones and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Intentional or not. I mean, I think that sometimes even some of that stuff can come down to like what you just don't care to learn about your subject before you interview them.
Yeah, I think those are the more interesting characters to cover besides Alex, or ones who their motives are confusing, or, what they're really setting out to do is worth contextualizing.
Yeah, Greenwald is interesting. I don't know if Jordan could handle it, though. He has a particular hatred of Greenwald. That might be tough.
Maybe that's a Jordan on Vacation week episode.
That might be. That might work. There are other folks, like real haters, like real Nazis, that have shows. You could find them. They'd be more difficult to find, but you could find them. And we could cover that, and I've thought about that. But one of the things also that makes Alex worth covering is he's not honest about his positions. And he's not honest about what he stands for and the influence that he has in the world. Whereas those Nazis are. They are hateful, and they know they are, and they don't care that people know it. And, that to me is like, well, we're not going to argue our way out of like someone who's like, yes, I hate black people. I hate Jews or whatever. That's not something that's going to be like, here's what he's saying. There's nothing
Nope.
for our show to cover there. Whereas Alex has so much crypto stuff going on and pushing you towards those more extreme beliefs while pretending that's not what he's doing. And I think that is the interesting dynamic, one of the interesting dynamics. And I think that's similar to what you were talking about with Greenwald. There is a sort of a stealthy motivation somewhere. It's not totally above board what he's up to.
Yeah, it's kind of like a plausible deniability, nudging, a more subliminal way of trying to, or maybe not trying to, but just subliminally something is getting across.
Mm-hmm.
Before I let you go, is there anything else you want to say about your show, or any social media or anything you want to plug for Knowledge Fight?
No, I mean, knowledgefight.com is our website, but we don't engage with social media that much. I might try and do better with that, but I feel like most of it would just end up like people wanting to fight, and I'm not super interested in arguing. But yeah, thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun chatting. I always like talking about this stuff, and outside of the show itself, there's not a whole lot of people who enjoy hearing about these things, it turns out.
Thank you for agreeing to be on the show, because I find that there's so much there. Yeah, just keep up the good work with Knowledge Fight, because I do think that it's just an interesting way to better understand what's going on in the whole right-wing world, not just with Alex, but kind of like the through lines,
Mm-hmm. That's so nice to hear. I mean, that is definitely what we hope to achieve. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a good one.
You too. Take care.
Bye.